How bad do you think the dilemma that Rachel Reeves faces is?
It's extremely bad. The country is in a grave economic and financial crisis, and whoever won the election was going to have to do some very tough and unpopular things. That's why both parties fought the election. The big parties that thought they might be in government fought the election with no policies whatever, bland, sort of meaningless nonsense, because they didn't want to set out what they knew in the national interest they'd have to do. And what they're going to do is get on with the tough, difficult decisions as quickly as possible. Don't read the opinion polls, forget that, it'll be hugely unpopular, and trust that the benefits start showing in time for them to have a chance of being re-elected in 5 years' time. That's what we did when Margaret got in, and I think it's very similar to the situation when we got in
1979.
after the winter of discontent, when we were an economic laughingstock. And exactly the same things then. We fought on a bland election. There wasn't any Thatcherism in our manifesto. That's how we got elected. And then once we got in, we started dealing with the power of the trade unions. We started controlling public spending, cutting public spending. Geoffrey Howe's 1981 budget was the most unpopular budget I remember in my entire political career.
It was absolutely agonising.
And it was absolutely essential. It turned the corner. It got us back to economic common sense and sound policy.
You're not suggesting, are you, that Rachel Reeves is going to be as unpopular as Geoffrey Howe was back then? Or maybe you think
she does the right things. She should be, yes.
Very, very, very interesting.
I mean, Jeremy Hunt did some of the right things. It didn't do anything for the last government's popularity, but it was impossible in the run-up to an election. You have to do the tough, difficult things. I mean, I'm not saying it for the sake of it. My first budget, I raised the tax burden on the country by the biggest percentage of any budget since the war. I exceeded Geoffrey Howe. You have to. Political skills are trying to explain to people why you're doing it, and perhaps being a little less gloomy by raising expectations that it's going to get us back to sensible levels of economic growth and rising living standards again.
Because where it seems to me that Rachel Reeves has some reason for grievance is that the previous government, the Conservative government, was very specific about the tax cuts that they were going to make, but was not at all specific about the spending cuts that were going to pay for them.
Well, that's around its election, yes. That was true of the last years of Gordon Brown. It was true of the last years of Jim Callaghan, because they knew they were in a mess. And if we'd gone out, if either party had gone out and said they were going to raise taxes and they were going to control public spending, not all of it. One reason you've got to cut some public spending quite fiercely is because you've got to spend some more on social care, skills training, defence, probably, when you can. But if you spelt all that out, the election would have been a battle between the Liberal Democrats and Reform. The public are against change, let alone anything that might be uncomfortable.
And this is partly, I guess, about sort of temperament as well. Do you think that Rachel Reeves has got the steel that the Thatcher government had? I mean, she seems to be pretty tough. She hasn't deflected at all so far. I hope
so. I'm an admirer of Jeremy Hunt and of Rachel Reeves. And it doesn't seem to me they disagree with each other very much on these things. I mean, Jeremy, because there was an election coming, because of political pressure, had to make 2 cuts in national insurance, which he knew perfectly well he shouldn't be making, but it didn't cost too much. And no doubt sooner or later they'll be restored. But I'm sure if you talk privately to, I haven't for some little time, case of either Jeremy Hunt or Rachel Reeves, they would give a very similar description of what the Chancellor has got to persuade the Prime Minister, whoever you've got, to allow them to do to start putting the country back on its feet again. We have a terrible debt problem. And one of our biggest items of public expenditure that's been rising like mad is the debt interest that our taxpayers all have to pay on a public sector debt that is now almost as big as our whole national GDP.
I suppose one of the big differences between this Labour government now and the governments that you've been talking about, Ken, is that this government has been elected after specifically promising not to raise all the big taxes, not to raise income tax or VAT.
That was a terrible mistake. The 2 big parties talked themselves into that. I can't remember which of them first said, well, of course, not ordinary taxes. So in the end, neither of them could allow the other to outbid them. So that both signed up to this absurd proposition that they were never going to raise the rate of income tax, and so on, corporation tax and that. In fact, of course, both of them are committed to raising income tax, but not by raising the rate. Yes, whoever won was going to carry on raising income tax by freezing the thresholds, which is a bit unfair because that bears particularly heavily on people on average and below average earnings more than it does on the better off. So we are raising interest rates, income tax, and we're going to carry on doing so for the next 2 years.
Given where we are now, and given what those promises that were made in the election campaign, you've had the experience of sitting there and looking at the books. How would you raise the money that Rachel Reeves needs to raise?
Well, if I were there and wasn't saddled with these election promises, I think I would have raised VAT and certainly restored the national insurance cuts.
But if you had made those promises?
Well, then you do have to look at the things that are being gently trailed in the newspapers.
Inheritance tax.
Inheritance tax, capital gains tax. And that, the public like that, because most people don't pay them. You do have to be careful because of the economic consequences of overdoing that. And capital gains tax has the disadvantage that it's largely a tax on inflation. It's not on real terms gains. It's the paper gain you made compared to when you bought whatever you bought and when you sold whatever you bought. And given that we need to encourage more investment in this country, it's one of the high priorities, you're a little restrained. So I'm sure they're searching for other things.
So here we are, talking in early September about a Labour budget. I think perhaps both of us expected that we'd be sitting here talking about the coming general election at this point, in against the background of interest rates coming down and the Bank of England doing popular things, etc. Just your reflections. We haven't talked since then about that process of the election, the choices made by Rishi Sunak and where we are now.
I don't know why he went in July, myself. Perhaps he's just got fed up of trying to carry on without being able to do what he knew. He's a perfectly sensible, reasonable man. He knew needed to be done if we were really going to tackle our problems. If you'd had these figures so you'd be able to talk about the rising GDP and falling inflation and so on, perhaps even get an interest rate cut out of the Bank of England, it might have saved 20 or 30 Tory seats, I think. But we were like, I'll stop reminiscing, but we were like past governments like Callaghan's or John Major's, absolutely doomed to be routed. You couldn't have the 4 years of Boris Johnson and Liz Truss and go on to win an election. You were bound to be massacred.
To put it brutally, do you think your party got the beating it deserved?
Yes. Not the beating that I may gather. I rather exempt Rishi and Jeremy from that. I don't solely blame Boris and Liz, and Boris did 1 or 2 quite decent things, to be fair. But to have Boris Johnson and Liz Truss as Prime Minister proved to be quite the biggest political disaster of my lifetime. And if we ever get people like that Prime Minister from any party again, heaven knows how bad the next crisis will be. But meanwhile, brace yourself. It's going to have to be tough. But instead of just spreading gloom all the time, we share these problems with other Western countries, and who knows, if you do it properly and toughly, just as Margaret demonstrated, 3-4 years' time, we might look around and say, we had a sensible government, we've done the right things, and actually things are getting better. And I'm quite optimistic about that outlook. That's how Margaret got herself back in 1983, having smashed the trade unions and rebuilt the country's finances.
Well, if we needed one thing this evening, it was a grain of optimism and some proper perspective.
I'm always an optimist.
You are. Thank you very much indeed, Lord Clarke, for joining us. I hope we speak again very soon.